Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to start our new unit, which is all about cells and how cells are important to life, to living things. So, in our last unit, we talked about the fact that all living things are made of one or more cells, and also the fact that cells are the smallest building block of life. And so we're going to dive a little bit deeper now into cells and their importance, the history of their discovery, um, the function of their different parts, and just how important they are uh, to life and to living things. So, to start that out, we're going to start out a little similarly to our last unit, in that we're going to take a look at some history to begin with, looking at the history of the discovery of cells. Obviously, because cells are the building block of life, they have been around since God created living things. However, we have not always known about them. And so we're going to take a look at how it is that scientists discovered cells and the things that they have learned about cells. So let's take a look actually at a video that kind of uh, introduces us to some of the scientists that have made major discoveries about cells.
One of the great things about science is that when scientists make a discovery, it's not always in a prescribed manner, as in only in a laboratory under strict settings with white lab coats and all sorts of neat science gizmos that go beep. In reality, the events and people involved in some of the major scientific discoveries are as weird and varied as they get. My case in point, the weird history of the cell theory. There are three parts to the cell theory. 1. All organisms are composed of one or more cells. 2. The cell is the basic unit of structure and organization in organisms. And 3. All cells come from pre-existing cells. To be honest, this all sounds incredibly boring until you dig a little deeper into how the world of microscopic organisms and this theory came to be. It all started in the early 1600s in the Netherlands, where a spectacle maker named Zacharias Janssen is said to have come up with the first compound microscope, along with the first telescope. Both claims are often disputed, as apparently he wasn't the only bored guy with a ton of glass lenses to play with at the time. Despite this, the microscope soon became a hot item that every naturalist or scientist at the time wanted to play with, making it much like the iPad of its day. One such person was a fellow Dutchman by the name of Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who heard about these microscope doohickeys, and instead of going out and buying one, he decided to make his own. And it was a strange little contraption indeed, as it looked more like a tiny paddle the size of a sunglass lens. If he had stuck two together, it probably would have made a wicked set of sunglasses that you couldn't see much out of. Anywho, once Leeuwenhoek had his microscope ready, he went to town looking at anything and everything he could with them, including the gunk on his teeth. Yes, you heard right. He actually discovered bacteria by looking at dental scrapings, which, when you keep in mind that people didn't brush their teeth much, if at all, back then, he must have had a lovely bunch of bacteria to look at. When he wrote about his discovery, he didn't call them bacteria as we know them today, but he called them animalcules because they looked like little animals to him. While Leeuwenhoek was staring at his teeth gunk, he was also sending letters to a scientific colleague in England by the name of Robert Hooke. Hooke was a guy who really loved all aspects of science, so he dabbled in a little bit of everything, including physics, chemistry, and biology. Thus it is Hooke who we can thank for the term the cell, as he was looking at a piece of cork under his microscope, and the little chambers he saw reminded him of cells, or the rooms monks slept in their monasteries. Think college dorm rooms, but without the TVs, computers, and really annoying roommates. Hooke was something of an underappreciated scientist of his day, something he brought upon himself as he made the mistake of locking horns with one of the most famous scientists ever, Sir Isaac Newton. Remember when I said Hooke dabbled in many different fields? Well, after Newton published a groundbreaking book on how planets move due to gravity, Hooke made the claim that Newton had been inspired by Hooke's work in physics. Newton, to say the least, did not like that, which sparked a tense relationship between the two that lasted even after Hooke died, as quite a bit of Hooke's research, as well as his only portrait, was misplaced due to Newton. Much of it was rediscovered, thankfully, after Newton's time, but not his portrait, as sadly no one knows what Robert Hooke looked like. Fast forward to the 1800s, where two German scientists discovered something that today we might find rather obvious, but helped tie together what we now know as the cell theory. The first scientist was Matthias Schleiden, a botanist who liked to study plants under a microscope. From his years of studying different plant species, it finally dawned on him that every single plant he had looked at were all made of cells. At the same time, on the other end of Germany was Theodor Schwann, a scientist who not only studied slides of animal cells under the microscope and got a special type of nerve cell named after him, but also invented rebreathers for firefighters and had a kickin' pair of sideburns. After studying animal cells for a while, he too came to the conclusion that all animals were made of cells. Immediately, he reached out via snail mail, as Twitter had yet to be invented, to other scientists working in the same field, and it was Schleiden who got back to him, and the two started working on the beginnings of the cell theory. A bone of contention arose between them, as for the last part of the cell theory, that cells come from pre-existing cells, Schleiden didn't exactly subscribe to that thought, as he swore cells came from free cell formation, where they just kind of spontaneously crystallized into existence. That's when another scientist, named Rudolf Virchow, stepped in with research showing that cells did come from other cells. Research that was actually, how to put it, borrowed without permission from a Jewish scientist by the name of Robert Remak, which led to two more feuding scientists. Thus, from teeth gunk to torquing off Newton, crystallization to Schwann cells, the cell theory came to be an important part of biology today. Some things we know about science today may seem boring, but how we came to know them is incredibly fascinating. So if something bores you, dig deeper. It's probably got a really weird story behind it somewhere.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. So let's take a little bit more of a look at the history of the discovery of cells and what we now know of as the cell theory. So if you take your notes, you can start filling these in. So we're going to start our look with Robert Hooke, who was around in the mid 1600s. And it was in 1665 that he published a paper um, where he identified these chambers inside of a piece of cork as cells. So he was looking at some cork, which comes from a cork oak tree. Um, and cork, of course, is that stuff that bulletin boards and things are made out of that we stick pins and staples into. But he was looking at a little piece of cork oak tree underneath a microscope, and the shape of the parts inside of this cork reminded him of those small bedrooms, so to speak, or living rooms that monks lived in, and they were called cells, so he named these chambers in the cork cells. Um, the word is, of course, from Latin because so much of science comes from Latin. So the word is from the Latin word cellula, which means small compartment. And so that's what he was thinking of when he came up with the name cells. Uh, Another person we're going to take a look at is Robert Brown. Robert Brown, um, lived almost 150 years after Robert Hooke. Um, but he was an English botanist. Of course, a botanist is someone who studies plants. And as he studied these plants, he's discovered that all plants are made of cells. And not only are they all made of cells, but all of these cells, or nearly all of them, seem to have this dark blob inside of them. And he called that blob a nucleus. A nucleus. And so hopefully we will soon be taking a look at some plant cells and being able to see that same dark blob that Robert Brown discovered in 1833. Then we move on to Matthias Schleiden and Theodor Schwann, who made some of their most important discoveries in 1839. These were both German scientists, as noted in the video that we watched, and these two men worked together and discovered that material inside the cells seemed to be moving, um, and occasionally cells themselves were moving. And this brought them to the conclusion that cells must be alive. That is what they discovered. And they also contributed to the cell theory in that they realized that it was both animals and plants that were both made of cells. And then shortly thereafter, Rudolf Virchow, also mentioned in the video, also German. He was a physician or a doctor. And while doing experiments in regards to some diseases that he was trying to learn more about, he found that all cells actually come from other existing cells, from cells that are pre-existing or already exist. They divide and produce new cells. Previous to that, as was mentioned briefly in the video, most scientists up to that point believed that cells just kind of appeared, so to speak. They just crystallized or became a an existing thing out of nothing, essentially. Uh, Rudolf Virchow confirmed that that indeed was not the case, and that cells actually come from other living cells. They grow out of them. All of these men and many others throughout the 16, 17, and 1800s contributed to the development of what we now call the cell theory. And there are three main principles to this cell theory, three main parts to it. The first one is that all living things are made of one or more cells. We talked about that even in our last unit when we talked about the characteristics of living things. We said that they are all made of one or more cells. Uh, you can't have something that is not made of cells and call it alive. Okay? Cannot be considered to be a living thing. The second part of the cell theory tells us that a cell is the basic building block of life. Uh, it is possible for certain types of singular cells to actually uh, be considered to be alive because, as we talked about in our last unit again, there are many living things that are made of just one cell. Um, and so while it is true that we now know, and these gentlemen uh, in the 1800s, anyways, were maybe just beginning to discover this as they discovered things like the nucleus. The cell itself is actually made up of a lot of different parts. We now know a lot more about those parts and are still learning more all the time. But we still consider the cell as a whole to be the basic building block of life. We can't just say the nucleus is the basic building block of life, because that nucleus needs a whole lot of other parts to be able to do what it needs to do. So we consider the cell the basic building block of life. And then the third part of the cell theory is that living cells come only from other living cells. They cannot just appear, they do not just come out of nowhere, uh, but cells have to come from other cells that are already living. Now, cells need a lot of substances, or they're made of a lot of different substances and are in need of a lot of different substances in order to function. And some of these substances that are necessary for cells to do what they need to do and to survive are known as macromolecules. And there are four of them that are incredibly important, and they're essentially what cells are made of and what allows them to function. So, um, a macromolecule forms when many small molecules join together. So, molecules are made up of atoms, and we'll talk a lot more about atoms in eighth grade. Atoms are much, much smaller than cells. Cells are made up of lots and lots and lots and lots of atoms. Macromolecules are formed when some of these atoms join together to form molecules, and then those molecules join together to form what we call macromolecules. Macro means large. So large molecules where a lot of different atoms and elements have joined together. Macro comes from the Greek word for long. Um, and then these four molecules that we're about to learn about, these four macromolecules, make up all of life and are found in cells. The main ingredient in any cell is water. Water is not a macromolecule. However, water is needed in order for the four macromolecules that we're about to learn about. Water is needed for those macromolecules to function properly. So, water is also a key part of cells and key to life. It is not a macromolecule, but these macromolecules do need water in order to work. And of course, probably a lot of you know that a human is made up of about 70% water. Well, that's because cells are generally made up of at least 70% water. And since we as humans are made up mostly of cells, um, it would stand to reason that we are in that same percentage range. Well, let's take a look at what these four macromolecules are that that are so important to living things and to this function of cells. Those four macromolecules are known as carbohydrates. Perhaps you've heard of those before. We often shorten that word down to carbs, right? We talk about carbs for, athletes are eat lots of carbs to get ready for a competition or something like that. Well, it's because their cells need those carbohydrates in order to work well. Proteins, that is another type of macromolecule. Again, proteins are essential to your cells and all the cells of all living things to their ability to function correctly. Lipids is another one. Lipids are actually basically fats. So, lipids are also critical to the function of cells and therefore to the function of living things. The final one is nucleic acids. And probably the most famous of the nucleic acids is also known as DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. And so DNA is probably the most well-known of the nucleic acids. It is an incredibly important part of cells and is something that we will spend more time talking about in coming units. Macromolecules are responsible for so many things, but just a few of them would include things such as communication. Now, cells don't go around talking to each other, but they do send chemical communication from one cell to another, or even from one part of a cell to another. Uh, so these macromolecules are helpful in cell communication. In cell transportation, again, cells don't go driving around in cars, trucks, trains, and planes. However, they do move substances from one part of a cell to another or from one cell to another. And so they transport these substances. The macromolecules also help with the chemical breakdown of substances. They also help with structural support of substances, the structural support, excuse me, of cells, and they also help with the storage of energy. We're going to look into this a lot more in another video that you will soon be watching by the Amoeba sisters that talk about these macromolecules, which are also sometimes called biomolecules. That's what they will be called in the Amoeba Sisters video. Same thing, just another name for the same substances. Uh, these four macromolecules or biomolecules, of course, as we stated a moment ago, are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Um, and sometimes they're also known as organic compounds. So they do have a few different names. I think in CK12 they use that term instead. So just be aware, macromolecules, biomolecules, organic compounds, these are all the same thing. They are these four long molecules that are essential to the functioning of cells and therefore to the functioning of life. All right, ladies and gentlemen, have a great day.